Art and Literature by Stella,
Romel
and Heejeong Kim. Colonial art was very reminiscent of European tastes because of the colonists' close ties with their homeland. Emerging artists such as John Trumbull, Charles Peale, and John Copley had to journey back to Europe to become trained and paid for their work. An exception to this trend was Benjamin Franklin's cartoon Join or Die. It pushed for separation from Britain, and this antagonistic view of the motherland was more prominent in literature. As seen in art during the colonial era, connections to the Old World were very prominent. Poor Richard's Almanac, written by Benjamin Franklin, acted as a user's manual for the colonists on shaping the American character. Other authors acted as revolutionary triggers. Pushing for independence from Britain in a republic was Thomas Paine with his Common Sense, published in 1776. A key factor of this new cultural character was the setting of the artwork. Washington Irving wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, both of which became classics set in America. Irving was a part of the Knickerbocker Group, which was a group of nationalist writers, which also included James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote Leatherstocking Tales and The Last of the Mohicans, which had a prominent Native American presence. These writers magnified the national pride after the War of 1812. Tying with the nationalist theme, American painters who emerged from the Hudson River School excelled in portraits of romantic American landscapes. These paintings that came from this institution had a common theme of expanding the American territory with divine blessing, championing manifest destiny.
In the 1830s, the Transcendentalist movement sprung. The theory of Transcendentalism was that the human senses did not provide truth, but rather it was an inner light that connected one with God. Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of the best-known Transcendentalists. He wrote an essay called Self-Reliance that told people to avoid conformity and to instead follow their own instincts. Henry David Thoreau, another Transcendentalist, wrote a book called Walden, which discussed his simple existence of 2 years in the woods, where he was in pursuit of truth by studying and meditation. Another Transcendentalist was Walt Whitman, who was known for his collection of poems called The Leaves of Grass. As a nonconformist, he strayed away from conventional poetry styles like rhyme and regular meter, and elevated the human form and mind.
Though transcendentalism and nationalism were very popular, many prominent writers were only inspired by them. Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women, addressing women's search for independence and financial problems in New England. Some did not conform to the positive tone of this era. Edgar Allan Poe championed the infamously dark tone with The Raven and The Fall of the House of Usher. Herman Melville focused on the eternal fight between good and evil in Moby Dick. These outliers diversified the anthology in America. Around the mid-1800s, tension was building to start the Civil War. David Walker advocated for the violent end of white supremacy through his appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Frederick Douglass, one of the most prominent abolitionists, wrote an autobiography about the inhumane treatment from the masters. The most influential, however, was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which described the splitting of families. Her work was so powerful that it was recognized by Abraham Lincoln as the book that started the Civil War. Although many advocated for the sake of mistreated blacks, Hinton R. Helper wrote The Impending Crisis of the South, claiming poor whites were suffering economically because they couldn't compete with slavery. These abolitionist works contributed largely to the start of the Civil War.
Some of America's literary landmarks came out of the turn of the 19th century. The Gilded Age, written in 1873 by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, came to represent the late 1800s because it satirized the greed and political corruption of the age. The Octopus, written in 1901 by Frank Norris, talked about the social problem of wheat growers battling with the railroad monopolies, a problem that is addressed later during the Progressive Era. The Call of the Wild, written by Jack London in 1903, discussed Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, in which the main protagonist, Buck, must learn how to survive in the wild. Progressivism occurred during the early 1900s. The muckrakers of the progressive movement aimed to correct the ills of society by exposing them to the public. Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives exposed the upper and middle class to the horrible conditions in which the lower class lived in. Lincoln Steffen's The Shame of the Cities showed the ties between corrupt government and corporations. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed the unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry. All these ills were fixed as a result of their exposure. The first film came from Thomas Edison in the 1890s, but the industry did not begin to flourish up until 1903, when The Great Train Robbery was shown in theaters. This movie became famous for its use of new techniques, like camera movement and on-location shooting. The first full-length classic movie that became famous was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, first shown in 1915. It was a commercial success, but deemed controversial for glorifying the KKK as heroes while defaming African Americans as monsters. The movie industry was changed in 1927 when the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, came out. The silent age of film was taken over by the talkies that are still popular in today's society. During the Roaring Twenties, the Harlem Renaissance arose, representing the popular black culture. Coming from New Orleans, jazz was the music of Harlem. Louis Armstrong and Joseph King Oliver are among those famous musicians who popularized jazz to the nation. Langston Hughes was another famous artist who wrote a volume of poetry called The Weary Blues that were published in 1926. His book talked about the importance of blues and jazz in a musician's life, almost like a way of life.
Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises and F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby both exemplify trends of the lost generation, the era after World War I, known for its use of drugs, alcohol, and excessive partying, and a lack of actual social progress.
Emerging from the reckless 20s, the long boom ended, launching the Great Depression and a need to escape reality. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster answered with Superman, who always did the right thing, contrasting with the corrupt and average American. His origin from Krypton was relatable with immigrants, especially Jews, having to conform to the American society. However, the do-gooder approach seemed to lack satisfaction for revenge. With less sympathy, more violence, and no superpowers, Batman stood for those who felt powerless and wanted harsher punishments. The emergence of heroes triggered a new obsession with the superheroes. They were released from harsh realities for decades to come. When America joined World War II in 1941, comics became propaganda supporting the war effort. This is seen with the creation of Captain America. Captain America became one of the most popular heroes of the war period because he was often shown fighting the Nazis and Hitler, and soon became the icon of America. The Black Hawks, a group of American pilots, were also created in response to the war, and fought the Nazis as Captain America did. Heroes like these represented America's stance on political issues during the war. The Germans, Japanese, and Italians portrayed in these comics were always shown in a racist negative light because they were America's enemies.
In the song Little Boxes, Malvina Reynolds satirizes the suburbs and how all the houses look the same, representing the conformity of the 1950s. The Everly Brothers song, Wake Up Little Susie, represents the pressures to conform within the youth, relaying how important purity and reputation was to the youth culture. During the 50s, many white artists did covers of songs originally by black artists. This can be seen in Pat Boone's cover of Tutti Frutti by Little Richard and Elvis Presley's cover of Hound Dog by Big Mama Thornton. Boone and Presley's covers were significant in that they censored many inappropriate lyrics to make them more suitable for the white population. This trend was prominent because of the sexual connotation that African American music had that was deemed inappropriate for white. Changing times in the 60s. The song Times Are Changing by Bob Dylan displays the idea that in the 60s, the civil rights movement was growing so fast among the youth that it could not be stopped. This was representative of the veracity of the civil rights movement. Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones expressed youth angst in the 60s due to the pressure of the 50s to conform, something many youths did not want to do. This left them feeling dissatisfied and that they could not fit in, leading them to rebel and begin many youth movements. Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring displayed the effects of pesticides on the environment. This book was a huge part of the environmental movement in the 70s. Its most important effect was its help in the banning of DDT. It also inspired the creation of the EPA, or Environmental Protective Agency, as many of their goals reflected issues addressed in Silent Spring. The 70s were a time of uncertainty amongst most Americans. Much of the youth felt they had nothing to stand for after the wave of movements and passion during the 60s. This caused the youth in the 70s to turn to drugs for a thrill. The drug epidemic of the 70s was emphasized in comics like The Green Lantern Green Arrow, in which the Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy was addicted to heroin. This reflected the problems of the regular people in the 70s, almost all of which knew someone affected by addiction. The rise in drugs prominence in the 70s can also be seen in the creation of the Green Goblin in the comic Spider-Man, where the Green Goblin was created by drugs, reflecting the level drugs affected people. Additionally, in the 80s, the villain Lex Luthor was changed into a modern businessman. This represents how the average Americans distrusted large business corporations. Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines confirms the ever-prominent objectification of women, especially in music and media. Macklemore's Same Love protests against discrimination on sexual orientation, promoting the legalization of gay marriage across the nation.